So I'm going to introduce myself again. I'm Pete Warnken. I'm Director of Resource Adequacy at ERCOT. And I've got, I think, a great panel. It's a good cross-section of those who have an interest in probabilistic resource planning. You know, we've got some, R&D organizations. We've got, developers of commercial software, and then the end users like myself. And Eric, way down at the end there. It's hard to see you from here. What I'd like to do for each of the panelists to sort of explain what their roles are in this particular space. And we'll start with Genevieve, and you've got a slide that you want to kind of give sort of an introduction and kind of what initiatives you're working on. Yep.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm Genevieve, or Jenna, with EPRI. We're a nonprofit organization that works around really a lot of different aspects of the power systems, from generation down to power delivery. One of the areas we focus on is resource adequacy research. I put together this slide just to give folks a little bit of awareness on some of the work we do, especially the work that is publicly available. So if anyone's interested, got a number of links and QR codes for folks. One of the things we've been working on is the Resource Adequacy Initiative. This wrapped up about a year ago. All deliverables are public. And this was really around revisiting the way we do resource adequacy. We've got deliverables on all the different aspects of this process. So metrics, tools, data, scenario development, a number of case studies where we apply those learnings. Climate Ready is another one of our initiatives that's just wrapping up currently, really looking at the impact of climate risk on all the parts of the power system planning framework. Again, all deliverables there are public. Invite you to check them out. DC Flex is an initiative that we're just starting, I think very timely for folks in the room here, around data center and data center flexibility and how we can leverage that in the electric grid going forward. I will say for this one, not all deliverables are public, but we'll have a handful that will be available to the public. And then we also run a resource adequacy forum, which is a webcast. We just had one previously on resource adequacy and flexibility. We're running one in a week and a half on how regulators think through resource adequacy, as well as a resource adequacy knowledge center website where we put together a lot of our publicly available information in one easy to find spot. Highlighted also a lot of other work we're doing. So invite folks to kind of click through that once the slides are available and check in on that. But just to say, there's all these different parts of resource adequacy, touching climate, touching data centers, really needing to look through kind of how we change our process. Resource adequacy, we've been doing the same thing for many, many decades and are really having to revisit fundamentally how we approach that, and invite you to all check that out.
All right, thanks, Jenna. So yeah, over to Kevin, and you can give your spiel.
Great, thanks, Pete. I don't have a slide. My name's Kevin Carden. I am the Chief Product Officer for PowerGEM. PowerGEM is a software vendor. We license a number of products. I was formerly the president of Astrape Consulting, and at Astrape we licensed the Servum tool. I've been working with Pete and ERCOT for over a decade, I believe, worked with EPRI for years, worked with MISO for years, looking at the resource adequacy question, the probabilistic approach to planning, looking at reliability risks and so forth. One of the goals of the merger last year with PowerGEM is bringing some of those tools into the transmission planning space. So PowerGEM's other three software products, we have DASER, Terra, and Probe. Each of those are in different spaces. Terra is more in the transmission reliability assessment. So we are working on mergers, actually exploring some neat things with ERCOT where we explore the synergies between the various tools. So run nodal analysis in Terra, run zonal analysis in Servum, and let the models talk to each other. Also have DASER, which is a short-term nodal market tool, and Pro, which is more of a long-term planning tool.
Yep. Patrick, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Patrick Brown. I'm at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL, where I'm part of the long-term system planning group. And I'll give a quick overview of how we think about this problem probabilistically. The core component of this are two coupled models, the REEDS Regional Energy Deployment System, which is our capacity expansion model, which has been around for over 2 decades. And then on the resource adequacy side, the Probabilistic Resource Adequacy Suite, or PRAS, and both of these models are tightly coupled. So REEDS, if you go back a slide real quick, so REEDS is doing the capacity expansion modeling side, taking in inputs about the existing and planned capacity, demand forecasts, fuel price forecasts, et cetera. It's designing your system in steps from now through 2050 or later. In each model year, we then pass that capacity expansion design system to the resource adequacy model, which is doing 2 things, assessing the reliability of that system, and if any regions don't meet their reliability target, then identifying the weather periods that cause the most stress to the system, passing those back to the capacity expansion model so that you are making your capacity expansion decisions informed by what are the most stressful periods on that system. Not necessarily peak demand, it might be combinations of high demand, low wind, low solar, interregional weather effects, and so forth. So on the next slide, going into the PRAS model a little bit, this is a fairly standard resource adequacy model. We're modeling unit outages probabilistically using Monte Carlo sampling. Those outage probabilities are dependent on temperature, so you get correlated outage effects at a regional level. Once you have those outage profiles, if you go back one slide, we're then modeling at chronological hourly resolution the dispatch of the system so that you can get the resource adequacy value of storage as well as interregional transmission. And all this is done over multiple weather years. Depending on the system, you get different types of weather that end up being stressful for the system. 2 other minor points here are, again, looking at the common cause failures. We capture that for thermal outages based on a temperature-dependent forced outage rate. For wind, we also model extreme cold shutoffs and then icing-related shutoffs for wind, so understanding the reliability impacts of those. And then a piece that's in progress is, rather than using just historical weather, transitioning to using ensembles of future climate scenarios, which are downsampled to the high resolution that we need, both spatially and temporally, and then sampling from those different possible future weathers in addition to the different outage draws that you get from the Monte Carlo. 2 other ways that we incorporate probabilistic modeling, the one that we've been working a lot on recently is doing Monte Carlo sampling of the inputs to your capacity expansion model, just understanding that future fuel price projections, technology cost projections, electricity demand, and so forth are not precisely known, especially if you're modeling the whole U.S. out to 2050. So rather than just doing scenario analysis for those, you can sample from probability distributions. And then in this example on the bottom, if you're interested in looking at interregional transfer capabilities, instead of just getting one number for the 2050 optimal capacity between 2 regions, now you're getting a probability distribution. And then the final side, and this is the piece that we don't model probabilistically, but rather through scenario analysis, is the policy drivers. So we don't know how to put a probability on state, federal policy development. If anybody does know, please let me know. But so these are things like national electrification incentives, emissions constraints, interregional coordination, and so forth. And so for these, you're exploring different scenarios so that you can understand, say, the value of interregional transmission and how that changes under different policy environments. But the key point is that all this is enabled by having these tightly coupled capacity expansion and reliability models so that you can assess the combined energy ancillary service and reliability benefits of generation, transmission, and storage in one combined framework.
Kostas, on to you. You've got some slides to review.
Yeah, thank you, Pete. Hi, everyone. My name is Kostas. I'm an electrical engineer with PNNL. And I will start by saying that no model is good without good input data. And that's the first slide that you can see here. So at the lab, a lot of research is being done on developing different weather data sets that then feed our power system tools. In particular, we are very much interested in correlated weather data sets that we then translate to load, wind, and solar profiles, but also on different type of data sets such as wildfire or other force outage rate, temperature-dependent force outage rates, for example. And those data sets should also be spatially scaled in the specific level of the power plants, for example, that those events could occur. So we pay a lot of attention to this type of granular analysis. And in the next slide, I also want to touch on some of the previous discussions on how we can make all the models to talk to each other. So what we're trying to do in the lab is more kind of a holistic probabilistic transmission planning, where we start with all these different weather data sets, and this could be 40 years of historical, future, and different warming scenarios, for example, that we feed our resource adequacy tools together with other force outage rates. And those resource adequacy tools with all the probabilistic analysis in Monte Carlo, then we can diagnose different events that happen in the system, different hours and from different weather years. And those could be heat waves, cold snaps, for example, or water droughts. But what is also really important is the coincidence of those events. Like when those events happen all together, this is where the system is under stress. But then also looking at the capacity expansion, right? We do have new build-outs to supply the future demand that we then feed to our nodal production cost models, where we also run some security constraint operations. And the trade-off there is we're trying to understand like how through a security constraint operation we can redispatch resources that can dictate some of the modeling decisions that we made in the capacity expansion, how we can improve those decisions before moving to the more physical power flow analysis when we run contingency analysis, and we also look at additional improvements in the form of reactive support that can support those planning decisions. So again, this goes back to not a specific tool, so we can say that the process is tool agnostic, but the whole development and linkage of the tools is the essence here. And in the next slide, I'm touching a little bit more on the probabilistic transmission planning, where we're trying to connect capacity expansion and resource adequacy and what it goes between those two tools. So in particular, we're very interested in updating the planning reserve margins back to the capacity expansion decisions by looking events that have happened and caused unserved load in the system. But we're also interested in updating the capacity credits of resources, because we know that in each planning year, adding more solar or more wind deteriorates and declines some of the capacity credits for those resources. So these are important aspects to consider in our planning phase. In my last slide, I would like also to touch on the complexity when conducting this type of probabilistic analysis. So you can see here we have different planning years, but also different load growth scenarios. Then we have different weather years. This is just an example. And then we have different hydrology scenarios. So when all these factors together, we're producing thousands of scenarios that we need to run our probabilistic analysis, and that gives a computational kind of complexity that we're trying to address through different ways in the lab.
Yeah, thanks, Kostas. So Eric is a user of software, and a lot of challenges putting that together. But he's going to, again, he's from MISO, so he's going to review accreditation methodology. And actually, yeah, can we can cover that towards the end of the presentation or the panel, because we're going to hit accreditation as a topic. So, but Eric, I certainly want to turn it over to you and get your thoughts on doing probabilistic planning at MISO and what software you're using, and maybe give us some sense of what the challenges are as a being responsible for actually working with these models.
Yep. Hey everyone, Eric Rodriguez with MISO. We're the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. We are one of the largest RTOs with 45 million end-use customers across 77,000 miles of transmission, over 550 market participants. So pretty large RTO, and I've been helping out for nearly a decade in the resource adequacy space, helping with what we call the planning resource auction. That's our version of the capacity market. And with resource accreditation, resource registrations, and all that good stuff. So MISO's been utilizing a probabilistic model for over 15 years to perform LOLE analysis. And back in 2017, we made the transition from GE Mars to the SURVEM tool. And through that, we are setting resource adequacy requirements. We have the system-wide planning reserve margin requirement and the zonal local reliability requirements. We do separate our region into 10 local resource zones. And I guess it would help to say, too, that we are across 15 states as well as the Canadian province of Manitoba. And so I guess we can get into the kind of accreditation reforms. MISO recently filed and was accepted by FERC in October of last year. So maybe I'll hold that till later. So.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I wanted to dive into the topic of integrating all these tools. So, you have capacity expansion, power flow, production costs, a layer of probabilistic modeling, and other side tools as well. And the question is, how do you get all these to work together, to integrate them, or at least, harmonize them? And it's not necessarily just a software issue, although obviously that's a big deal, but also it's an organizational issue because, in the ERCOT world, we have our resource adequacy department, we have our transmission planning department, and in order to really work with I'll call it an Uber platform, you need to work together, and so it's a management situation as well. So everyone is working off of the same language. Everyone understands what a probabilistic tool is, and really how to feed and take care of it. So what I wanted to do is talk a little bit more about that, and actually I'll start with you, Kevin. So as you mentioned, we're working with you on looking at your various tools and trying to integrate them and look really at sort of the kind of the synergistic effects of looking at resource adequacy and transmission planning. And so I wanted to get your take on kind of what are the advancements that you've pushed forward with your tools. And again, this is the innovation, which is what we're all about here. But yeah, I wanted to get your take on that and maybe what you might be investigating for the future.
Thanks, Pete. Yeah, so one of the challenges that the industry, we feel like, is facing, I'm glad you hit on this, is that it's an organizational challenge. There are different planning paradigms in the different spaces, and that's always been a challenge, that transmission planning has historically been deterministic, that even if they're looking at extreme cases, extreme weather, it's usually a scenario that's developed off the cuff. There's kind of deterministic ways of producing those. In the probabilistic space that we're in, that we're trying to bring to transmission planning, it's a full exploration of the state space. Look at all the possible weather combinations. It's not just the summer peak case or the winter peak case. It's not just N-1 or N-1-1. I mean, at a typical hour in ERCOT, I imagine there are 10, 15, 20 generators that are offline at any point in time. So we need to capture that full stochastic range of possible outcomes in the transmission planning space as well. In order for that to become actionable, you really do have to fully explore the state space. So that's what we're looking to do with this exercise with ERCOT, where we run 50,000 8760s in SERVM, and from that, we've got different filters where we can filter down to high net load periods or high outages or large diversity between zones. And so discrete options in SERVM that we can select to say, let's write a raw file or the inputs to be read into Terra to recreate this particular snapshot in Terra. And then we run enough of those in Terra to be able to solve for convergence, to be able to determine, all right, with this full range of scenarios that we look at, are we getting convergent incremental reliability metrics? So from our zonal reliability analysis, we may show, all right, we're at 0.1 LOLE. But if we impose these additional transmission constraints from the nodal model, we surface an additional 2 events in 10 years. And that can kind of help us. We have to reset some of our planning standards when we look at it on a more integrated basis, but hopefully that kind of provides more actionable outcomes for planners in that space. I talked about kind of the SERVM to Terra. There's also a Terra to SERVM. Better representation in the zonal models we think is critical as well. So we use Terra, and we know many of our clients have used Terra in this context for years to determine the import-export constraints between zones. So we also do a clustering analysis. We're working through this exercise right now with ERCOT, where instead of using weather zones, we look at electrical proximity to define the zone. So we end up with 13 or 14 different zones within ERCOT. From the nodal analysis, we'll use that to represent in Servum a different zonal framework. We'll still have the 40 weather years of all the profiles for all those 13 zones. Look at the import-export constraints from Terra in Servum, and then sending that back, and there's iterations back and forth between the models to hopefully kind of build a much more refined assessment of the system.
Well, thanks for that. Yeah, very, very exciting times in this area, and just a little bit more background on that. This is I guess a proof of concept for this year, and what we're headed is to hopefully implement this fully integrated system, work with our transmission planning department, and parlay that into a bunch of different purposes. So I think most of you are aware of the reliability standard. We're going to be using this framework, at least the nodal representation, coming up for next year's reliability assessment. And then, longer term, we want to have this integrated system and really this management process in place. I wanted to maybe ask Eric. So again, you've got the same situation where you're looking at transmission planning and resource adequacy. So what's your take on how you're able to integrate the different tools, and again from an operational perspective or project management perspective, how that comes into play, and maybe what are some of the challenges you face in doing that?
Yeah, so in MISO today, those are separate processes, but do make their way into the auction engine clearing process for the planning resource auction. So using the Terra tool, we will do a transfer analysis where we're setting seasonal, what we call capacity import and export limits. We're studying that transfer capability for each of the 10 local resource zones in MISO. And then that's going to go into reducing the local reliability requirement that's set for each zone. And so that's going to be determined by probabilistically modeling that zone's resources and their load internal to that system as if it were an island without external support from either neighboring zones or external regions. And it's going to be a really 1-for-1 megawatt reduction in the local reliability requirement using that capacity import limit to calculate the local clearing requirement. And so think through the efforts that PowerGEM are pursuing as far as maybe nodal analysis and interweaving the Servum and the Terra tool. There might be some opportunities there for us to better capture from a probabilistic requirement setting standpoint, those transmission constraints. But within our own probabilistic risk model, we do assume it's more of a reliability model, transmission free internally, and with no congestion. We assume that all resources are fully deliverable to their interconnection service. And so, but that is something that MISO is evaluating and is on our roadmap for this year, is to study and determine maybe what are some of the impacts of including transmission in our probabilistic model.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I want to turn back to just modeling technology and issues with computing power. Probabilistic analysis has been around for quite some time, and with parallel processing and other technology improvements, you can do a lot more with probabilistic assessment, but it's gotten more complicated. I want to talk about large loads coming up, but with IBRs, wind and solar, again, just modeling uncertainty in loads, that's just become more complicated. So, even though you have more computing power, the problem that you're facing is much more complicated. So what I want to do is ask the panelists their perspective on that. So maybe Patrick and Kostas, you're doing sort of nationally oriented studies, but I want to get your take on how you're able to integrate the different pieces of your modeling system. And also want to ask you about, how you're compromising. So, we talked about that yesterday, Patrick. But really, what kind of compromises do you need to take when you're looking at decisions about how granular you want to do your probabilistic analysis? So, Patrick, let's start with you.
Sure, yeah. So we kind of try to meet a lot of different users' needs with reads and pres. We do have users who just run it on their laptop, which you can do if you're willing to wait a day and not really do much else on your laptop during that time. But for large production runs, we have a high-performance computing environment where you're doing a lot of runs in parallel. Similarly, lots of samples in parallel for the resource adequacy side. And so, the easy answer there is just, well, compute power has gotten cheaper, and we have a lot more of that available now, and so that just opens up the door some more. In terms of choosing where to put that on the reliability side, it does kind of depend on your system. So if you've got a lot of large units, then doing lots of samples of outage probability matters more. Whereas if you're relying a lot more on variable wind and solar and storage, then individual unit outages don't really matter, but the weather variability matters a lot. And so there isn't really always one answer to how best to apportion those degrees of your resolution. But the thing that you're always trying to solve with these models is that everybody wants, more temporal resolution, more spatial resolution, more operational resolution. And so we're constantly trying to balance those out. And typically the default settings for reads and pres are a kind of middle of the road, but we simultaneously have, the option to go down to county level resolution where you're modeling hundreds of zones in a region rather than our kind of 100 zones for the whole US. Similarly, you can increase the time resolution if you're very interested in storage. You can't do all that at once, so it kind of is up to the analyst to understand what's the most important for this study and check, look into the alternatives. And so the main thing there is building a lot of flexibility into the model so that we, have our kind of recommended set of assumptions, but the user can decide to ramp up, any of those pieces of resolution if that's what's most important for their study.
Yeah, Kostas, how about you?
I will agree with Patrick. In the lab, we also use high-performance computing to parallelize many of the simulations we're doing, especially for resource adequacy, that they're very computationally heavy simulations. So, for example, we use we split the simulation period in each week, so we run 52 weeks in parallel, where we then put back together. That really helps, but it's beyond that, right? I mean, it's not just how you can utilize the computing power, but it's also how you can strategically select the scenarios, which I was talking about earlier. We have thousands of scenarios, and we know some of those scenarios may lead to the same answer in terms of reliability output. So how we can down select the thousands of scenarios to those that will incur different outputs. So there is a research that we're currently conducting where it's kind of clusters similar events and selects events that can, more strategically target those weather years that are of interest. Beyond what Patrick said, that it's up to the user to play with the spatial and temporal resolution of different studies. And maybe the last piece I want to add is more foundational formulations on those problems. I mean, we know these are established, problems that have been there for years now, but there's still research on how we can, think of the problem from a different angle. We see now a lot of AI going on multiple assets of power system analysis, how we can bring some of those, faster solvers, for example, to mitigate some of the computational burden.
So, Kevin, I'm throw it your way. Yeah, what are you doing in that regard, trying to make the models work more efficiently together, and dealing with the granularity and solution time issues?
Yeah, unfortunately, simplifying assumptions is a very complicated topic. We found that trying to downsample and to find intelligent ways of sampling your data sets leads to all sorts of challenges. There are all sorts of asymmetric effects in weather and capturing operational. So I think I would echo the statement that, we would like to just run everything, just run every weather year, every load forecast error, enough generator outages to get convergence. Combine all these tools to run your capacity expansion with your production cost modeling, with your resource adequacy modeling, with your nodal production cost modeling, so do it all simultaneously. There are certain boundaries that we've identified that we think that it still makes sense to separate out, but we are trying to throw a lot more compute. We run about 1.5 million core hours a month across most of our clients. We've got a private cloud service that we use. So, it's a lot of compute that we're running. We still kind of break the distinction at the nodal versus zonal. So we're running our 50,000 8760s in a zonal model because it's about 100 times faster than running the nodal production cost modeling. But we are trying to combine several of these aspects where we do the capacity expansion modeling endogenously in our resource adequacy simulations. We think that picking the next candidate technology, especially as reliability standards become more challenging, as ERCOT is introduced here with multiple metrics that we have to meet. It's not as simple as representing that as with a reserve margin and capacity credits, because the contribution of every resource class changes with penetration and it changes with different metrics that you use, so it's challenging. If I can just throw it all into one model and come up with a solution from one model, we think there's a lot of value and merit to that, so that's really where we're investing a lot of our effort, at least on the zonal stage. And then having that capability to filter down to scenarios that are critical to model in the nodal context.
Thanks, Kevin. So I'm going to turn to large loads. So you can't have enough discussion on that. So Jenna, I wanted to get your take on the deflex. You mentioned that. And, one of the questions is that ripe for, working with probabilistics at some point in time, or is that in sort of the far future, or is that something that you and others at EPRI have been thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will say that the DC Flex initiative is just launching right now. We do have plans to deal with probabilistic analysis for that. That piece of the analysis is due to launch in 2026, and so we're still very much actively scoping out what that'll look like. One of the benefits of this initiative, if we've got sort of our more traditional members at the table, like our utilities, like our ISOs, but we've also got data center owners and operators at the table, and so that's really helping us guide and scope our analysis. From a sort of purely research perspective, I think there's a few different directions you could feasibly take this. Large loads and integrating those within a probabilistic resource adequacy analysis, I think in of itself isn't necessarily the most challenging question. We've had large loads before. We know how to integrate those. I think part of the challenges associated with that is first off, just the speed and the magnitude at which they're potentially interconnecting and some of the uncertainty associated with that. And also how they're interconnecting, what degree of flexibility might we be able to obtain from them. And so I think part of the scope for DC Flex is definitely going to be specifically looking at those varying interconnection agreements and the ways in which large loads can feasibly interconnect and operate within the system and what impact that can have on resource adequacy. I think another interesting question would be kind of taking that uncertainty in terms of when and at sort of what capacity they're going to interconnect into the system. I don't know yet whether that's in scope for DC Flex, but I think something like that's probably best explored within maybe a stochastic capacity expansion modeling framework.
So, I've been thinking about this. How do you model large loads? Specifically the reliability standard and reliability assessment, and is there some way to represent them probabilistically, or are you really just restricted to doing some sort of scenario analysis, which is really the kind of the fallback? But I wanted to ask the panelists, looking at large loads and just going beyond scenario analysis, has anyone looked at being able to apply some sort of probability distribution or other probability methods to look at large loads. And, specifically, it's obviously the magnitude, which you mentioned, but, it's also, the ramp rate. There's uncertainty there, and certainly we've been struggling at ERCOT getting more data to figure out, in terms of the timeline when all this large load is going to be energized. But yeah, I wanted to get anyone's take on that area, and if you've done any research or have any plans to do some probabilistics around large loads.
So are you asking how do you assign probability to particular large loads coming into the system?
Right, so maybe you take data centers. Yeah. So yeah, are we at the point where we have enough data? And probably the answer is no. Yeah. But yeah, the idea is to, based on some historical background on ramp rates and, looking at what the success rate is of adding these large loads, can you come up with some, probabilities or likelihoods of a certain amount of large load coming into your system at a given point in time? And again, we're just thinking that through right now, so yeah. we don't have a solution. I don't have a solution, but I wanted to know if anyone else has been thinking about that. Yeah, certainly using history as a guide to assign probability, but I think to the point that was made earlier, some of these are just challenging and they lend themselves more to scenario analysis. But to the extent you can you can use history as a guide to assign probabilities to load growth, and we have clients that do that, or with respect to generation coming online, other factors that are kind of unknowns, assigning probability to those using history as a guide. I think one of the challenges that we face in this space is folks generally try to put too much conservatism on the input side. And so I think kind of looking at the history of lots of entities, you get all these requests in, you just roll that into your load forecast. Obviously, it's probably not realistic to assume that everything is going to be delivered. I think our approach is generally model the system the way that we think it's going to exist in the future and apply your conservatism on the reliability metrics. So maybe reliability metrics need to be revisited, should be more conservative than a 1 day in 10 standard to accommodate some of the additional uncertainty that's not factored in discretely. Anyone else have a perspective on that?
Yeah, I think all I'll add, we're just starting to do this kind of through the Monte Carlo side, as I mentioned, so sampling from different potential future demands. And just wanted to know, you can think about this in terms of kind of the local uncertainty, like say you have, you're expecting 10 gigawatts somewhere in the state, you can sample, at the county level or something to get distributions of, where might this go. But then also the kind of systemic uncertainty, to what degree, what level of confidence is there nationally in these very, very large numbers that we're seeing, and it's important to sample within that range. I think the main thing is, you can look at a projection for the future cost of, solar or batteries or the future demand for data centers, and I think the one thing we know is that the future is not going to look like that one projection, and so getting more used to sampling, from these broader distributions rather than always just taking, the average or the high or the low, and understanding just that there's a lot of interesting things that happen between those extremes is getting to be more important as we see, both on the supply side, but now also on the demand side.
Costas, do you have any?
Just one more comment is that I would say in addition to defining, or the challenge of defining a probability behind the magnitude, how much load growth those data centers will incur, is also the shape of those data centers, which is again like how you add a probability on the shape, right? How the shape of the data centers will play a role in the total future load shape and the ramping required to accommodate those shapes. Will they be very rapidly changing, or will it be more flat? And we know in the past, like more of the traditional data centers were more flat, but this may change in the future with AI data center driven. So it's an additional complexity to add as a probability, and still an ongoing open research question, I would say.
Yeah, I think he raises an important point that there are lots of resource adequacy considerations around large loads other than just the magnitude. Like you think about the variability or the shape impact. If it's a flat load, what does the reserve margin need for that load? Well, it's probably not 20% because we don't have much load variability. Right. But then I've got capacity accreditation questions on the other side. What's the ELCC of a battery that's going to serve a flat block of load? Well, it's zero, right? Because it's not bringing in any of its own energy. And so there are lots of interesting questions that we're having to explore as well with the integration of the large loads, the shape, the magnitude, the variability. There's all sorts of things that influence this.
Price response, and it is complicated. And so, I mean, we're sort of at the ground level, I think, as far as being able to model this stuff. So I guess my next is a segue, Patrick. We talked about sampling and having sufficient historical data to do probabilistic analysis, and a big challenge I think for a lot of ISOs and utilities, everyone is having to deal with extreme winter weather events and summer events. So in ERCOT's case, we don't have a lot of significant weather events where we have good solid data to support the analysis. Obviously, we have Uri and Elliott and some of the other ones. But to represent what the probability or return rate is of some of these storms, it's a really difficult, complicated situation. So what I wanted to do is ask the panelists, for your take on, what's really the best way, kind of the state of the art, for trying to, represent, extreme weather events, whether it's, kind of summer renewables drought or a, winter storm event. So I don't know, maybe Eric, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, so in our model, we'll look at, specifically with a focus for generator outages, we have something in our model called cold weather outage adders. So looking at historical forced outage data, we use a 5-year time frame for that. Beyond that, during extreme events, especially during the winter season, how much higher are outages during those critical times than they might be on average? And so we implement that in our model as a profile that's correlated with time and with temperature. But it's a challenge to make sure that there is that correlation, and that we maintain that even with random forced outages, how those are randomly drawn. So those are one of the areas that we're looking at lately as far as kind of extreme weather representation and how that can lead towards reduced margins on that particular hour of simulation.
Does anyone else want to weigh in?
Yeah, I just want to note, I think this is both very important and very challenging. I mean, so we do the same thing, look at correlations between historical outages and historical weather. And so if you can, reproduce the outages during Winter Storm Uri, for example, your model is being successful. Of course, as we heard this morning, I mean, there's been a response to that. There's been a lot of weatherization of generation units and so forth. And so our old fits between forced outage rates and temperature are now out of date because we've kind of responded on the system, and we won't really know how good they are until the next, cold snap of that magnitude rolls around. So we kind of handle this differently on the thermal side, where we do it statistically, and then on the wind side, where it's kind of more bottom up, modeling these particular extreme cold and icing events. But just to note, it is challenging for the reason you noted, that thankfully these events are not super common, which just means that the data on them is limited, and so just continually updating that data as much as possible is important.
I think agree with all of that. I think within the probabilistic space, it's less about sort of explicitly only representing extreme events, and it's more about making sure that you're representing all possible feasible events, of which extreme events are part of it, and furthermore sort of associating a probability with those that's realistic. And I think it's that second piece that's maybe the most challenging. So there's a few different ways we can do that. One is sort of looking at the historical data and making sure that that's represented accurately, and I think everyone touched on that. There's making sure that you have a large amount of historical weather data set, that's correlated, that's applied across sort of all weather-dependent features in your model. So that's your wind, that's your solar, that's your thermal-dependent outages. And then there's another piece of this, which is sort of how do you account for the fact that extreme events might change as we take into account climate change. And I think that is maybe the more challenging piece of it. So we've got climate projections we're exploring, applying those to the data sets. Some of those extreme variables, I think, are a little more straightforward to predict within our climate projection models than others. So things like, how your temperature might change with various climate projections is going to be a bit more straightforward to project than, whether a winter storm cell is going to come in at a certain point in time. So I think that's something sort of meteorologically that's still somewhat of an open area of research. And I'd say one more thing we can do if we're specifically wanting to look at extreme weather events within the probabilistic framework is explore metrics that go beyond just expected metrics and look at tail end or distribution metrics, for example, a percentile metric or a CVAR metric, to really kind of bring attention to those extreme events and the potential impact on the system. And I might hazard and say, maybe we're at a point where if we don't have a great probability for an extreme event and don't quite know how to incorporate that within a probabilistic framework, it's worth maybe exploring that within a deterministic framework as an add-on to that analysis.
Good points. We've got about 11 minutes left. What I want to do is turn to resource accreditation because, again, you've got a lot of probabilistic analysis that supports that. So, let's see, Eric, you wanted to talk about your process, DLOL. So go ahead.
Yes, so I'm going to describe what MISO's recent accreditation reform effort has been. Is this what we call the direct loss of load accreditation methodology? And I know this is a kind of foreign concept to ERCOT, but in our capacity market, we want to make sure that we are evaluating and crediting resources, not just during periods of peak demand, but also any periods of time where there might emerge more elevated risk for reliability concern. And so this really is a two-step process. The first is going to be more probabilistic, where within the probabilistic model, we're going to solve the model to 1 day and 10 years LOLE. Across the year, and then look at the availability or the generation of, on average during those hours, of each resource class in particular. So in later slides, I'll describe the 13 resource classes MISO has defined in our filing, but really looking at the availability during what we're calling those critical hours. And those critical hours are any hours that exhibit loss of load or where the margin is less than or equal to 3% of load in that hour, and you can see that definition there on the bottom of this slide. And so looking at the critical hours here, we're going to weight those hours by the largest volume of expected unserved energy in that hour, or in other words, the loss of load. And then looking at, the kind of lowest weighting would be those hours that are still within that 3% range, but have the largest margin. Next slide. And so here on this slide, you can see we've got by season, and we do establish our accreditation on a seasonal basis. For the 13 resource classes, we've defined what are the kind of indicative DLOL results. So this was using our most recent completed planning year 2025-2026 probabilistic model. However, we're not planning to implement the direct loss of load accreditation methodology until planning year 2028-2029. So in that time, up until then, every year, MISO is going to produce class level indicative results that we'll share publicly, as well as resource level results that will be shared confidentially with each of MISO's generation owning market participants. And so this would apply to all resources that participate in MISO's capacity market, with the exception of external and emergency only resources. And I'll just plug that MISO recently filed a reform for demand response and emergency only resources with FERC. And we're receiving comments and we'll be responding to those in the near future. But each resource outside of externals and emergency only resources will be assigned to one of these 13 resource classes. And then to to get from resource class level accreditation to the individual resource level accreditation, it's going to be a deterministic process where we look at a recent 3-year history of availability measured as energy offers in MISO's energy markets, and using that as a method to, on a pro rata basis, allocate the resource class level megawatts to the individual resources within that class.
So Jenna, we're running out of time, but I wanted to ask you about your initiative, looking at accreditation methods.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things we're exploring within a current DOE study right now is looking at different resource accreditation methods. So there's not one single way to calculate resource accreditation. ELCC is probably the most common method, but it's not the only one, as we've seen. And kind of figuring out how different those results can be from one method to the next. And what we're seeing is there's really a lot of nuance from one method to the other, especially in systems that are high renewables, high storage. We're seeing quite a bit of variation, really still exploring what this could be due to, but at its core, a lot of these accreditation metrics are really focusing on risk during just a small amount of those hours. So sometimes what we're seeing is, 1 or 2 or 3 sort of weather days within the whole risk period are what's really influencing your risk. So a small change to, a small perturbation to your system can really have an outsized impact on your resource accreditation metric result. So really exploring that risk, I think one of the findings we found was using an EUE, an expected unserved energy metric, as opposed to a LOLE, loss of load expectation metric, leads to results that are a bit more stable, at least in the case studies we've analyzed. I'll say it's an active research area and something with a lot of nuance, and those metrics can be sort of very variable from one system to the next.
All right. Well, I wanted to turn it over to questions. So let's see. What sort of biases, if any, are a concern with resource adequacy probabilistic models? So anyone want to jump in on that one?
I think 2 that I'll start off with. One, of course, is that our historical profiles for demand and wind and solar availability are not necessarily good predictions of the future with climate change and so forth. And so there's a possibility for kind of systemic bias one way or the other there. The other piece that we've been focusing a lot on when we look at the value of interregional transmission for reliability is that, if you're only assessing resource adequacy locally, then you're missing out on the potential for increased interregional coordination to contribute to your system reliability. And so if you've designed your metrics only based on your local load and not considering the possibility for anti-correlated weather patterns over larger spatial scales, then you won't see that value and you won't build the transmission and you won't get the benefits. And so that's of course a much higher level consideration around, is there going to be more interregional coordination? But that's the kind of thing that is kind of baked in to the model that can be easy to forget about.
Anyone else want to comment?
I'll just say, I think, when I review any resource adequacy model, like summary, there's a lot of focus on sort of your inputs and your assumptions, and maybe less of a focus on how those specific models are created, what tools used, what the underlying data might be. And I think what we found is that can be hugely impactful. And I think there's something that we need to bring more awareness to as an industry.
I'll just offer one observation that I think on the outcome of these probabilistic models is just recognizing that a lot of the solutions that are being proposed often are in competition with each other. So we've talked about some of them today. So large load flexibility, perhaps, that's a flattening of the load. Residential demand response, flattening of the load. Battery storage, flattening of the load. All of those are very robust solutions and they have a place, but kind of coordinated consideration of those in your accreditation framework, I think, is critical because they're often competing for the same megawatt of reliability contribution.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. It didn't get into a lot of detail on that problem. Let's see, we got the second question here. Any thoughts on probabilistic versus robust optimization methods, and which are most applicable in which contexts?
I would say robust usually account for the worst case scenarios, and we value those as inputs to some of the outputs that they produce in terms of the metrics we are out there, but usually we like to have a more kind of fair input of many different weather scenarios, for example. We don't want to target only to those tail events to do the resource adequacy. The main reason behind that is also because some of those LOE and metrics that we're using, at least in our analysis, update some of the planning reserve margins. So we don't want to necessarily build against the very kind of, the worst case reliability events that we see in the system. And this is, back to the initial discussion we had about how we could make the tools communicate with each other. One, where we're trying to achieve here is finding an equilibrium between cost and reliability. So we want to kind of have a fair treatment between those two trade-offs. So again, we value the outputs that the robust optimization gives, but when we go to the planning phase, we want to build resources that, yes, they are reliable, but they're also economical in the way that where the, probabilistically speaking, the most anticipated events that will happen in the next 10, 20 years.
Anyone else want to weigh in?
Yeah, I'll just say, in talking about the probabilistic method, when you're talking about how you're going to credit resource and what you're going to set your seasonal maybe requirements from a planning reserve margin standpoint are, you want to make sure that you're capturing this number of scenarios, and you don't necessarily want to overemphasize these extreme conditions, but we also want to make sure that we plan our system to ensure that we can, for lack of a better word, weather those more extreme temperatures. And so in that context, MISO's historically used a probabilistic model to set requirements, now is using it to start to set accreditation, and we feel like that's one of the better approaches to account for a large variety of scenarios, both from temperature, load, resource availability, et cetera.
Right. Well, we are out of time. Just real quickly, we had a question this morning about applying probabilistics to our capacity, demand, and reserves report. So I'm not going to say much about that, but yeah, we are thinking about that, but we're really focused on the reliability standard and the tools that we have right now, to do that type of analysis. And then, what do we do with the CDR? Well, it can serve as a kind of like an interim report card on resource adequacy. So again, there may be some, step changes that we want to make to it, and maybe someday, it can become like a probabilistic product like we do with the monthly, risk assessment. So, but yeah, no decisions have been made, and again, we're really focused on the reliability standard, for the time being. So that's all I had.